Gabby Petito and Brian Laundrie Moab Investigation Part 3. I asked Officer Pratt how he came to the conclusion in his report that nobody reported Brian struck Gabby. Officer Pratt said he spoke to Brian, Gabby, and the witness, none of who reported this. Officer Pratt said by the time he was able to write his report, he recalled that he had 3 people all stating the opposite. Officer Pratt said in order for him to get access to the dispatch audio from the original caller witness, that information had to be formally requested and would take time. Officer Pratt said when he was writing his report, he was questioning himself on if he had even heard the original report from dispatch correctly due to the 3 statements he had being contradictory to what he remembered hearing from dispatch. I asked Officer Pratt again about the statement in his report about nobody reporting Brian had hit Gabby, despite the statement from Gabby that Brian had grabbed her face and caused a scratch. I asked Officer Pratt if he didn't consider someone grabbing a face a strike or a hit. Officer Pratt said he didn't consider a grab to be either of those. Officer Pratt gave examples of a hit being a hit, a slap being a slap, and etc. Officer Pratt explained that he believed it was important when we interview people to figure out what kind of contact was made and explain that contact. Officer Pratt said maybe we could have done better at this. Although he doesn't consider a grab to the face a strike, he stated it could be an assault. Officer Pratt said it's important to describe the contact and the circumstances surrounding the contact. I told Officer Pratt that Gabby said Brian hit her and described it through demonstration, face grabbing. Officer Pratt said he never recalls Gabby stating or acknowledging Brian hitting her, other than grabbing her face. Officer Pratt said he only recalls Gabby replying, "Well, I definitely hit him first." This is accurate, but after this response, Officer Pratt asked if Brian hit her and Gabby replies, "I guess, but I hit him first." When Gabby describes the violence against her, the only thing she ever describes is her face being grabbed. Regardless of whether or not there is confusion on what is being called a strike or a hit, Officer Pratt acknowledges that Brian caused injury to Gabby by grabbing her face, and Gabby interpreted being hit as having her face grabbed, at least according to her response. I asked Officer Pratt why there wasn't any follow-up with Brian regarding the statement Gabby made of Brian grabbing her face and causing injury. Officer Pratt said he thought it had been taken care of. Officer Pratt said Officer Robbins heard this information and Officer Robbins had spent the majority of his time with Brian, while Officer Pratt spent the majority of his time with Gabby. Officer Pratt said, "I shouldn't make these assumptions, but I assumed that he addressed it and it was corroborated and should have, talked to Brian more about that." Officer Pratt acknowledged the amount of time that they had on the side of the road investigating this incident and said, "Some of these calls require more than that, and this was one of those calls where I wish we had more time. I wish I hadn't been called away. I wish I didn't feel like I had to rush at all." Officer Pratt also said, "If I didn't talk to Brian about that or it wasn't followed up with Brian, that should have happened for sure. I guess I assumed it had. I didn't know it hadn't." Officer Pratt explained that at this time the only on-duty patrol officers were him and Officer Robbins. Officer Pratt stated that Officer Robbins was still in field training and Officer Pratt is required to be on every call that Officer Robbins is on. According to a survey in 2019, the population of Moab was just over 5,000 people, while tourism saw over 3 million visitors. It's believed that tourism has surpassed that number the last couple of years due to the COVID-19 pandemic. Officer Pratt said, "So how much time do you spend on a call? I work 10 hours, and I gave 1 1/10 of my day to one couple, and I have many other calls. The other calls that are going on, a guy laying in traffic, that it's important to him that I come and drag him out of traffic. All these calls are important. If I had my way, I'd spend as much time as I needed on every call to make sure every call worked out right. But we don't have the staff. I'm not blaming the department, but we don't have the staff." I asked Officer Pratt why he didn't call the reporting party witness. Officer Pratt said calling witness would have been the next thing he did, or would have had Officer Robbins call him had he not been called away for a more urgent call. Officer Pratt stated at this time they had spoken to Brian, Gabby, and witness regarding this incident. Officer Pratt stated that his observations, as well as the statements made along with the physical evidence, everything was lining up. Officer Pratt said multiple times that witness should have been called. Officer Pratt said that if he had been called and witness repeated the same things that he told dispatch, the 3 other statements along with the physical evidence was much stronger than witness's statement. Officer Pratt described his line of questioning when talking with Gabby. Officer Pratt said he told Gabby, "We have 2 independent witnesses. I said this because I thought the witness would line up with what I thought this guy told us. I thought we were going to have 2. And her response was, "Well, I definitely hit him first." At the end of everything, her statement was like Brian's, was like my witness. Officer Pratt said multiple times during this call that there were 2 independent witnesses. Officer Pratt said this on multiple occasions and in front of Officer Robbins. Pratt said he told Robbins to get the reporting party's statement referring to witness. Pratt said later on, when reviewing Robbins' report, that he did not find a statement from witness. Pratt asked Robbins where the reporting party's statement was, and Robbins told him it was part of the report. It was then that Pratt learned that Robbins thought the reporting party was witness, not witness. Was one of the witnesses, not the other. When talking about not following up with the witness, Pratt said, "There's no way I can tell you this investigation should have had an end of report at the end of it without having talked to the guy who called. There's not an excuse for it. I can explain it. I can't excuse it." Pratt also said, "I can't imagine what he could have said, especially if it was what he told dispatch, that could have changed the decision that was made. Now, maybe if we didn't have the other independent witness, sure." The written report of Officer Robbins. In Robbins' report, there are similar concerns. Robbins spent the majority of his time speaking with Brian, but also got statements from Gabby regarding the incident. Robbins was the reporting officer, and ultimately the decision on how this case concluded was made by him. There are more details listed in Robbins' report than Pratt's. However, there are many details missing from the statements he received from those that he had contact with. There are also additional statements made in Robbins' report that are cause for concern. In Robbins' report, while describing the statement made to him from Brian, Robbins states, "Brian indicated Gabby went into a manic state. After watching the body-worn camera multiple times, I am unable to hear this statement actually made. It seems to me that Robbins draws that conclusion himself and states that is what Brian said. Robbins describes seeing minor visible scratches to Brian's face, but he doesn't indicate where these are at. Robbins states that he observed scratches on Brian's right arm, but again, doesn't indicate where on the arm the injuries are at. Robbins states that Brian believed the injuries on his right arm occurred when Gabby was trying to get his attention about Robbins being behind him with his lights on. Robbins then makes the following statement, quote, "This, however, was not consistent with Gabrielle's statement, further suggesting her confused and emotional state." Gabby's statement to Officer Robbins, which he documented in his report, was that she hit Brian in the arm to alert him to the police car being behind them with their lights on. Brian also said that he believed that is where the marks came from. Was Gabby hitting him when she was trying to get his attention? This adds confusion as to what Officer Robbins documented, as the information is actually consistent with Gabby's statement, which does validate the conclusion made by Robbins about Gabby's confused and emotional state. As with Officer Pratt's report, Robbins' report should include the who, what, when, where, how, and why, as that information could play a role in determining the predominant aggressor. There are many details not documented in his report, as well as details documented that appear to be speculation or just flat out inaccurate. Interview responses of Officer Robbins. There were multiple questions that I had for Robbins regarding his written report and the statements he reported to have made. When I asked Robbins if he had reviewed his body-worn camera footage of this incident prior to writing his report, he stated he thought he had but wasn't positive. Robbins confirmed he has access to the video but did not have access to the dispatch notes and audio. When I asked Robbins how many witnesses there were in this incident and whether or not he had talked to any of them, he stated there had been 2. Robbins stated he made contact with one witness and retrieved a written statement from him. Officer Robbins stated he had thought that witness was the person who had called 911, but later found out that was not accurate. Officer Robbins stated he didn't reach out to the other witness for his statement at any time during or following this incident. In Officer Robbins' report, he stated witness saw Brian and Gabby arguing over a phone. I asked Robbins if he investigated this further by asking Brian or Gabby about it, and Robbins said he did not. In Robbins' report, he stated that the witness observed Gabby grabbing into the van by the driver's side window. I asked Robbins when, where, and to who this information was stated. Robbins stated witness told him this on the day he collected the written statement. I asked this information because during the phone call with Officer Pratt as well as witness written statement, it appears that Gabby climbed into the van by the passenger side door and over Brian's lap. There was never any mention about it being through a window. I asked Officer Robbins if his body-worn camera was activated while collecting this information from witness. Robbins stated he wasn't sure if it was or wasn't. I have since found there is no body camera recording of this conduct. In Robbins' report, he stated witness was not entirely sure what it is that he had seen. I asked Robbins what this was referring to, as he gave a prior statement to Pratt on the phone and also provided a written statement and provided numerous details of what he observed. Robbins stated that witness was concerned about the incident possibly being involved in human trafficking. I asked Officer Robbins if what witness was not sure about was what he actually saw, or if he was not sure about the circumstances causing the incident. Robbins stated witness was confident in what he actually saw, but wasn't sure of what the bigger picture or reasoning might be behind what he saw. In Officer Robbins' report, he described Brian's statement of what happened. Officer Robbins said that while Gabby and Brian were arguing near Main Street, Brian had attempted to separate from Gabby so they could both calm their emotions. Robbins stated he got into their van and Gabrielle had gone into a manic state. Brian said Gabrielle, thinking he was going to leave her in Moab without a ride, went to slap him. As Gabrielle started to swing, Brian pushed her away to avoid the slap, and as a result, Gabrielle, off balance, but still caught Brian's face with some fingers, causing some minor visible scratches. I asked Robbins that Gabby went into a manic state was something that Brian actually said, or if it was something that Robbins concluded. Robbins said, "I haven't sat down and watched my body cam. I don't remember. I was also still on FTO field training and not very good at writing reports, so I'm probably guilty of possibly putting speculation in there." Terrible. I then brought up the series of events that Robbins documented above into how the physical fight started. I read it back to Officer Robbins and asked, "Do you recall what the actual information was that was provided to you by Brian?" And Robbins said no. I told Robbins that after watching the video multiple times, I was unable to find anywhere that Brian said Gabby was being manic. I also was unable to find anywhere that Gabby or Brian described that Gabby was scared Brian was going to leave her in Moab. I told Officer Robbins that Brian said he was worried that Gabby was going to leave him in Moab, but not the other way around. Robbins replied, "Well, I might have mixed those up." Sounds like Robbins really wasn't paying attention to a damn thing that was happening that day, just to be honest. I reminded Robbins of the series of events that he described being and how the physical fight started. I told Robbins I was unable to verify that the information he put down is what he actually said. Robbins replied, "I was trying to piece it together, because the stories were all over the place, as I'm sure you saw. They weren't actually, this event happened, that event happened, this event happened, this event happened. It was, this event happened, and then 20 minutes later, this event happened, and then 3 days ago, this event happened, so I was trying to piece everything together." In Robbins' report, he said, quote, "I observed some small scratches to Brian's right arm, and when I asked him about them, he supposed they must have happened when Gabrielle was trying to get his attention about me being behind them with the lights on. This, however, was not consistent with Gabby's statement, further suggesting her confused and emotional state." I asked Robbins what exactly was not consistent with Gabby's statement. And Robbins said, "If I remember correctly, Brian said that she grabbed his arm, or she said that he grabbed his arm. Anyways, the conflicting stories where one said he was being hit in the shoulder and the other one said that his arm was grabbed and that's what caused them to swerve and hit the curb. Something along the lines of that, at least." I told Officer Robbins that, in his report, he stated Gabby told him that she hit Brian in the arm, and Brian's statement was that Gabby pulled on the steering wheel. When Officer Robbins asked Brian about the scratches, Brian said they must have happened when Gabby was trying to get his attention about the cops being behind them. I told Robbins that the inconsistency is with Brian's story, not Gabby's. Robbins did not have a response. I asked Robbins what else he recalled Gabby being confused about, and Robbins said, "It didn't seem that she understood why we were there or the way that things could appear from the outside. She was obviously very emotional." I asked Robbins if he ever noticed any injuries to Gabby during his interactions with her, and Robin stated he recalled that there was a small scratch on one of her cheeks. I asked Robbins if he asked Gabby how she received the injury, and Robbins couldn't recall. I asked Robbins if he asked Brian about the scratch on Gabby's cheek. Robbins said he couldn't recall. Robbins said he remembered there being something about Brian grabbing Gabby's face and pushing her back, but he couldn't recall where he got that information. From the information I have reviewed, nobody asked Brian about the scratch on Gabby's cheek. There were a considerate number of details lacking from both officers, as it related to the statements made by all of those involved. Witness called 911 to report this incident, and his information, as well as his statement, was not obtained or documented in either of these reports. There is no information in either report to document any injury that was sustained by Gabby, despite her disclosing the injury. There was also very little detail regarding the injuries sustained by Brian. There were numerous injuries pointed out on Brian during their interaction, with very little of those injuries actually documented in the report. There are also numerous conclusions drawn or documented by Robbins that don't actually appear to be accurate. Both written reports are missing significant details as it relates to the who, what, when, where, and how as it relates to this incident. C. Officers should list the full name and date of birth and school, if available, of each child who was present in the household at the time of the offense. The names of the other children who may not have been in the house at the particular time should also be obtained for follow-up, and that is unfounded because it does not, it has nothing to do with this case. This section does not apply as it pertains to this investigation. Okay, D. When practical and legally permitted, video or audio record all significant statements and observations, and that is not sustained. Officer Robbins' body-worn camera was activated for the entirety of his contact with Gabby and Brian. I have learned that they do not have dash cameras on their vehicles, which also means they don't have in-car video or audio. Pratt's body-worn camera is activated from the time he arrives on scene with Brian and Gabby until he leaves for another call. The only videos that may be of importance that I have not received would be if there is video of when Officer Pratt first arrives at the Moonflower Co-op, where he meets the first witness. The other video would be of Officer Robbins following up with witness later on, and he collects a written statement from him. Officer Pratt received a recorded verbal statement from witness, and Officer Robbins later recovers a written statement from witness. I am unsure if all significant statements were documented because there have been additional information stated verbally through these contacts that was additional or different than what was already documented. After meeting with Officer Pratt, Officer Robbins, and Assistant Chief Palmer, it was determined that there are no videos of these two additional meetings as they did not activate any recording devices during these contacts. So based on the lack of information provided in the report or the inaccurate statements made in the reports, it is impossible to know if there were any significant statements or observations that would have needed to be documented and or recorded. E. All injuries should be photographed regardless of the severity, taking care to preserve the victim's personal privacy where practicable. Photographs should be taken by a person of the same sex. Victims whose injuries are not visible at the time of the incident should be asked to contact the investigations in the event that the injuries later become visible, and that is sustained. It says, while reviewing the body-worn camera of this incident, I determined that photographs were taken of Brian's injuries by Robbins, while no photographs were taken of Gabby's injuries. There were multiple injuries observed on both Brian and Gabby. Officer Robbins took into account Brian's personal privacy when asking him to lift up his shirt by having him move behind the van as to hide the view from passing motorists. Had there been pictures taken of Gabby, there was a female officer on scene to take those photographs if found to be necessary to preserve her privacy. On Gabby, there was a mark pointed out on her left arm, as well as a scratch on her right cheek. On Brian's injuries, they were pointed out by Park Ranger Ryan Krall near his right eye, left side of his neck, and the left side of his nose, the center of his face, and bruise and bleeding on the right side of his head, and a red mark near his right bicep-tricep area. Robbins photographed Brian's hands, left side of his head, his face, his neck, and right arm. Robbins asked Brian to lift his shirt up, and I believe I can see a long red scratch or scar underneath his left pectoral, but no photograph is taken. When asked during an interview, Officer Robbins stated he did not observe this mark, and if he had, he would have addressed it. When receiving all the requested documents for this investigation, I requested the photographs, but have not received any. In a subsequent interview with Robbins, I reminded Robbins of the numerous photographs he had taken during this incident, and I pointed out that the injuries on Brian were the only ones photographed and no photographs of Gabby's injuries were taken. I also said there were photographs taken of both of their driver's licenses. I asked Robbins why there were no photographs taken of Gabby's injuries. Robbins stated that Pratt spent the most time with Gabby, and he made an assumption that Pratt would have taken those photos. I asked Robbins why the photographs weren't uploaded to the report, and Robbins said, "That one to this day, I still don't know." Robbins went on to say that he believes he did not upload the photographs, but they were not there to be checked. Now, Robbins said that he did believe, but they were not there to be checked. Robbins stated the photographs are no longer on the phone he used to take photographs, and stated he used his police department issued phone to take the photographs. The way the policy reads, I interpret it as all injuries on the victim should be photographed. I would recommend that the policy be clarified to state that all injuries of all involved parties should be photographed. I asked Assistant Chief Palmer if he ever saw the photographs, and he stated he did not. I asked Pratt if he ever saw the photographs, and he also said he had not. Pratt provided an example of when the same thing happened to him in a different case around the time of this incident. Pratt stated they use software from Taser that is installed on their department-issued cell phones. The software allows you to take video and photographs and upload them into the software where they can access it later on to attach to the reports. Pratt said he had recorded a video using his phone off video surveillance that showed a hit-and-run accident. Pratt said there's proof he recorded the video from his body-worn camera, and then there's proof of him pulling it up later to show someone involved in the case, and the video was gone. Pratt said he hasn't had any issues with it since and doesn't know if something similar happened to Robbins, but acknowledged that losing photographic or video evidence in this way has happened before. Okay, number F is going to be unfounded. It's not going to pertain to this investigation. Same goes for G. H. Any firearms or other dangerous weapons in the home, if appropriate and legally permitted for safekeeping or as evidence. 1. This is going to be unfounded, and it's also not pertaining to this investigation. I. Another one that is going to be unfounded. It goes on to say this section does not apply as it pertains to this investigation. However, I will address some of the issues as it pertains to protective orders and how it could have applied to this case under the section Dispatch Assistance further on in this report. Okay, J, it's unfounded as well, but there is a note to it, and it says, this is already documented. I believe there was probable cause an assault occurred between two cohabitants, which makes this incident a domestic violence offense, and an enforcement action should have been taken. After reviewing all of the provided information, the following numbered sections that correlate with the numbered items above were observed, discussed, and/or documented during the investigation. 1. There is a conversation about the difficulty of separating Brian and Gabby because they have been living in the van for several months and they don't have any friends or family in the area. 2. Gabby said Brian kept telling her to shut up. Gabby also said, I was trying to get him to stop telling me to calm down. 4. When it comes to Brian and Gabby's physical state, they both appeared to be healthy and fit, with no obvious physical ailments. As it relates to mental state, Brian was very much in control of his emotions. Brian was calm and deliberate throughout this investigation and even joked around at times with the officers. Gabby was the complete opposite. At times, Gabby struggled to speak, and her emotions were consistently escalated. Gabby's emotions caused her at times to have to stop and catch her breath. Gabby was sobbing while begging and pleading with Officer Pratt to not separate her and Brian. When discussing the options of taking Gabby to jail or separating them, Brian asked, "Can I go to jail?" When he is told no, Brian asks why. Brian is told they don't have a charge for him. And Brian then jokes by asking, well, what if he took Robin's radio? Brian states multiple times that he didn't want to pursue anything against Gabby and wanted to get rid of this, referring to this impending charge. Based on the interviews and investigation, there was never speculation that Brian may not follow through with the prosecution, as Brian made it clear he didn't want anything done. Officer Pratt talked about the court process with Brian, stating officers had to follow the law, but said that the prosecutor could still potentially dismiss the case. The individual characteristics of Brian and Gabby were also talked about multiple times during this investigation. It is explained multiple times by Pratt that just because Brian was bigger and stronger than Gabby, he could still be a victim of domestic violence assault. Officer Pratt stated in his report that Brian was older, taller, and much heavier than Gabby. On scene, Pratt refers to Gabby as tiny, little, 105 pounds soaking wet, and numerous other statements regarding Gabby not actually being a threat or a danger to Brian based on their physical characteristics. So based on all of the information received in this case, I don't believe that any individual reason above was used as sole justification for not taking law enforcement action. There were multiple factors regarding this investigation discussed, but none of the reasons listed above were clearly used as sole justification reasons. I believe a combination of all of the factors above, especially Gabby's emotional state, caused Pratt to second-guess himself and call a supervisor. According to body-worn camera video, I believe the sole justification reason that enforcement action didn't take place was due to the officers not reading the entire assault code as well as their misinterpretation of the assault code. And of course, the next one is unfounded, and this is about an arrest. It does not pertain on the action of the officers. Okay, the next one, arrest is made. If no arrest is made, the officer should, and then it's not sustained. document the resolution in a report was unfounded. The offers facilitated a separation of Brian and Gabby while still ensuring they each had shelter for the day and night if needed, and whether or not the separation of the parties was voluntary is unclear. Robbins tells Brian that although he asks that they give each other the night apart and take advantage of the time apart to decompress and gather their emotions, that he is not legally required to hold them to it. Robbins tells Gabby that unless there is earth-shattering emergency news, to not contact Brian, as he wanted them to have time to relax, breathe, and contact their families. Brian was set up with the room using the help of a local resource to help victims of domestic violence. Outside of setting Brian up with the room and suggesting they both contact their families, I did not see there was any other resource referrals provided to Brian or Gabby. The officers documented this incident and resolution in a report. In a subsequent interview with Robbins, I asked him to explain the legal authority he had to separate someone if he didn't believe a domestic violence assault had taken place. Robbins went on to explain that he was going to arrest Gabby for domestic violence assault before concluding that the incident didn't meet all of the elements of assault. Robbins then decided to just separate them so they could cool off. Robbins stated he was trying to create that environment for both of them. I asked Robbins again what legal authority he had to separate someone if he didn't believe a domestic violence assault had occurred, and Robbins said, "I cannot answer that because I don't know." In a subsequent interview with Pratt, I asked him how Officer Robbins can lawfully require a separation to take place, instead of making a case against Gabby for domestic assault. Pratt said he can't. If you're not going to charge them, you can't. He required it. He didn't say by law. They didn't ask. As far as I know, you can't require someone to separate. He feels like if they gave any indication that they weren't going to follow that advice, then Robbins would have made the other case for the safety of both of them. Victim assistance. Because victims may be traumatized or confused, officers should be aware that victims' behavior and actions may be affected. The following applies to domestic violence and dating violence. A. Victims shall be provided with the Department's Domestic Violence Information Handout, even if the incident may not rise to the level of a crime. Sustained. B. Victims shall also be alerted to any available victim advocates, shelters, or community resources. Sustained. When an involved person requests law enforcement assistance while removing essential items of personal property, the officer shall stand by for a reasonable amount of time. Unfounded. D. If the victim has sustained injury or complains of pain, the officer shall seek medical assistance for the victim as soon as practical. Unfounded. E. Officers should ask the victim whether he or she has a safe place to stay and assist in arranging transportation to an alternate shelter if the victim expresses a concern for his or her safety, or if the officer determines that a need does exist. Unfounded. F. Officers should make reasonable efforts to ensure that any children or dependent adults who are under the supervision of the suspect or victim are being properly cared for. Unfounded. G. If appropriate, officers shall seek or assist the victim in obtaining an emergency order. Unfounded. Sections F and G do not apply to this investigation. A. I did not find through body-worn camera or reports that Brian or Gabby received the Department's Domestic Violence Information Handout. And B. Brian was provided a place to shelter for the night, utilizing a community resource they have for victims of domestic violence. Outside of the shelter, I could not find that anyone was provided with any information regarding a victim advocate. C. Before separating Brian and Gabby, Brian asked if he could retrieve some items out of the van before they were separated. Park Ranger Ryan Krall assisted Brian in retrieving any relevant or necessary items he needed. D. Gabby and Brian both sustained injuries, and Gabby mentioned pain she was having from her injury. Brian was asked if he needed medical attention, and Brian declined the offer. The policy only states that this applies to the victim. At the time Gabby disclosed her injury, they had not concluded who the predominant aggressor was, and she was not asked if she needed medical attention. There were also no follow-up questions asked to Brian regarding the injury that Gabby sustained. E. After finding out Brian and Gabby didn't have any friends or family in the area where one of them could stay, shelter was arranged for Brian utilizing a local community resource for victims of domestic violence. While Gabby was allowed to stay in the van they had been traveling and living in. Thank you so much for listening. We would truly appreciate a thumbs up or even a thumbs down if you feel so inclined. And until next time, this is Unjustified.